In a gleaming Manhattan office tower, a talented marketing executive was about to face her most challenging adversary yet. What started as reviewing quarterly reports took a shocking turn when she came face to face with her boss's third unwanted dinner invitation. Sarah Mitchell wasn't your typical corporate employee, having spent 3 years building an exceptional track record through merit and determination. When she rejected Richard Sterling's advances that final time, she had no idea she was walking into a carefully orchestrated campaign of retaliation that would transform her from rising star to unemployed whistleblower, sparking a legal battle that would expose decades of institutional corruption. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Sarah Mitchell adjusted her reading glasses and pulled up the quarterly marketing reports on her computer screen. The numbers gleamed back at her like small victories: client retention up 18%, new account acquisition exceeding targets by 22%, and campaign effectiveness ratings that made her department the envy of the entire firm. She allowed herself a small smile as she scrolled through the metrics, each data point a testament to the 60-hour weeks she'd been putting in since joining Sterling & Associates 2 years ago. Her corner cubicle might not have been the corner office she dreamed of, but the view of Manhattan's bustling streets below reminded her daily why she'd left her comfortable life in Columbus. The city had promised opportunity for someone willing to work hard, and Sarah had delivered on her end of that bargain. Her marketing campaigns for their luxury watch client had been featured in Adweek, and just last month, the pharmaceutical account she'd landed had brought in nearly $2 million in revenue. Sarah's fingers paused over her keyboard as she noticed a familiar shadow falling across her desk. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. Richard Sterling's cologne, an expensive blend of sandalwood and bergamot, always announced his presence before his voice did. "Sarah, darling." Sterling's voice carried that practiced warmth that had charmed clients and colleagues alike for the past 15 years. "Those quarterly numbers are absolutely spectacular. Simply spectacular." She turned in her chair to face him, offering a professional smile. At 45, Richard Sterling commanded attention wherever he went. His silver-streaked hair was perfectly styled, his Italian suits impeccably tailored, and his Connecticut boarding school accent lent authority to every word. The kind of man who'd never had to wonder if his ideas would be taken seriously in a meeting. "Thank you, Mr. Sterling. I'm pleased with how the campaigns performed this quarter." "As you should be." He perched on the edge of her desk with casual familiarity, a gesture that always made Sarah slightly uncomfortable. "Which brings me to why I'm here. I've been thinking we should discuss your trajectory here at the firm. Perhaps over dinner? Tonight?" Sarah's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. This was the third time in 2 months that Sterling had suggested dinner, each invitation framed as a business discussion, but carrying an undertone that made her skin crawl. The first time, she'd deflected by mentioning a prior commitment. The pari. Second time, she'd suggested they could discuss her career advancement during regular business hours. Now, facing his expectant gaze, she felt the familiar knot forming in her stomach. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Sterling, but tonight is actually my wedding anniversary." She gestured to the small framed photo on her desk, her and David at their college graduation, both grinning broadly in their caps and gowns. "David and I have dinner reservations at our favorite little Italian place." For just a moment, something shifted in Sterling's expression. The practiced charm cracked, revealing a flash of something darker underneath: irritation, perhaps even anger. His jaw tightened, and his blue eyes went cold. The transformation lasted only seconds before he caught himself, but Sarah saw it clearly. The mask slipped back into place so quickly she almost wondered if she'd imagined it. "Of course," he said, his voice maintaining its smooth tone, though it seemed to require more effort now. "How thoughtless of me. 5 years, isn't it?" 3, Sarah corrected quietly. "Ah, yes. Still newlyweds." The words carried a slight edge that made Sarah's pulse quicken. Well, perhaps we can find another time. After all, your career advancement shouldn't be delayed indefinitely. The way he emphasized indefinitely sent a chill down Sarah's spine. She glanced around the office and noticed that conversations at nearby desks had quieted. Marcus from accounting was pretending to read his email while clearly listening, and Jennifer from the creative team kept shooting worried glances in their direction. Of course, Mr. Sterling. I'm always happy to discuss my work during business hours. Sterling stood slowly, smoothing his tie with deliberate precision. Naturally, though I do find that some of our most productive conversations happen in more relaxed environments. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. We'll need to schedule something soon. The firm has some exciting opportunities coming up, and I'd hate for you to miss out due to scheduling conflicts. After he walked away, Sarah sat frozen for a moment, her heart hammering against her ribs. The casual threat hadn't been subtle. Choose between personal boundaries and professional advancement. Around her, the office slowly returned to its normal rhythm, but she could feel the lingering tension like static electricity before a storm. She opened her desk drawer and pulled out a small notebook she'd started keeping after the first uncomfortable dinner invitation. With careful handwriting, she documented the date, time, and details of the conversation, just as her mother had taught her to do with any important interactions. Document everything, her mother, a former teacher, had always said. Memory fades, but written records endure. October 15th, 3:47 p.m. Sterling approached desk, complimented quarterly reports. Third dinner invitation in 2 months. When declined, mentioned anniversary. Displayed brief anger before recovering. Implied career advancement tied to accepting social invitations. Colleagues witnessed interaction. As she wrote, Sarah's confidence in her professional achievements felt suddenly fragile. She'd believed that exceptional work would speak for itself, that merit would be rewarded regardless of politics or personal relationships. Her parents had raised her with that faith. Work hard, be honest, treat people fairly, and success would follow. It was the American dream distilled into a simple philosophy. But sitting in her cubicle, listening to Sterling's laughter drift from his office as he chatted with a male colleague, Sarah began to understand that the rules might be different than she'd thought. The quarterly reports that had filled her, with pride minutes earlier, now seemed like just numbers on a screen, powerless against the complex web of office dynamics she was only beginning to perceive. She closed the notebook and slipped it back into her drawer, beneath a stack of client files. Through her window, the Manhattan skyline stretched endlessly, full of promise and ambition. But for the first time since arriving in the city, Sarah wondered if her dreams were naive. The corporate world she'd entered with such optimism suddenly felt like a maze with rules she didn't understand and traps she couldn't see coming. Tonight, she would celebrate 3 years of marriage with David. Over candlelit pasta and cheap wine, she would tell him about her successful quarter and maybe mention Sterling's invitation in passing, framing it as merely awkward rather than threatening. She wasn't ready to admit, even to herself, that the foundation of her carefully built career might be shifting beneath her feet. The fluorescent lights continued their endless humming, and Sarah turned back to her computer screen. But the numbers that had once represented triumph now seemed to mock her naivety. In the reflection of her monitor, she could see Sterling's office where he was already on the phone with someone, gesticulating with animated enthusiasm. She couldn't hear the words, but something about his body language suggested he was already moving pieces on a chessboard she didn't even know she was playing on. 2 weeks had passed since that uncomfortable afternoon with Sterling, and Sarah had almost convinced herself she'd overreacted. The anniversary dinner with David had been perfect. He'd surprised her with a small silver bracelet engraved with their wedding date, and they'd laughed about her dramatic boss over tiramisu. Sterling had been cordial but distant since then, acknowledging her in meetings with professional nods but making no further social overtures. Perhaps he'd simply gotten the message. Sarah's keycard beeped red at the building's entrance turnstile. She frowned, scanning the card again. Another red beep. The security guard, an elderly man named Frank who always greeted her cheerfully, avoided her eyes as she approached his desk. "Morning, Frank. My card seems to be malfunctioning." "I'm sorry, Miss Mitchell. I'll need to call upstairs." His voice carried an uncomfortable formality she'd never heard before. The elevator ride to the 32nd floor felt eternal. Sarah's phone buzzed with a calendar notification. "Meeting request. HR conference room. 9:10 a.m. Urgent." She hadn't scheduled any HR meetings. Her stomach began to churn as the elevator dinged at her floor. The Sterling and Associates office hummed with its usual morning energy, but something felt off. Conversations stopped as she passed, colleagues suddenly finding their computer screens fascinating. Marcus from accounting gave her a sympathetic look that made her blood run cold. Conference room B was smaller than she'd expected, with floor-to-ceiling, windows overlooking the city and a polished mahogany table that reflected the morning light. Catherine Roberts sat at the head of the table, her silver hair pulled into a severe bun, wearing a charcoal suit that looked expensive enough to cover Sarah's monthly rent. Sterling occupied a chair along the wall, studying his phone with the focused attention of someone actively avoiding eye contact. "Please, sit down, Ms. Mitchell." Catherine's voice was crisp, businesslike. No pleasantries, no explanation of why Sterling was present for what should have been a routine HR matter. Sarah took the offered chair, her hands instinctively smoothing her skirt. "I'm not sure why I'm here. Is this about the Henderson campaign? Because the client feedback has been overwhelmingly..." "This is about your employment status with Sterling and Associates." Catherine opened a manila folder with practiced efficiency. "After careful review of your performance and conduct, we've decided to terminate your employment, effective immediately." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. The room seemed to tilt, the Manhattan skyline outside the window blurring as her vision narrowed. "I'm sorry, what?" "Your performance has been inconsistent, and we've received feedback about your inability to collaborate effectively with senior management." Catherine's delivery was clinical, each word measured and precise. "These issues have created an untenable working environment." "That's impossible." Sarah's voice came out higher than intended. "My quarterly reviews have been exemplary. I exceeded every target this quarter. My client satisfaction ratings are the highest in the department." Catherine slid a document across the table. "Nevertheless, the decision has been made. You'll find your severance package outlined here. 2 weeks' pay, continued health insurance through the end of the month, and a neutral reference letter." Sarah's hands trembled as she scanned the document. The language was filled with corporate euphemisms that masked the brutal reality. She was being fired for no legitimate reason. Her eyes found Sterling, who was still studying his phone as if it contained the secrets of the universe. "Mr. Sterling, surely you can explain this. You said my work was spectacular just 2 weeks ago." Sterling finally looked up, his expression carefully neutral. "I'm sorry, Sarah. Sometimes these things don't work out as we'd hoped." The casual dismissal in his voice sparked something fierce in Sarah's chest. "These things? You mean my refusal to have dinner with you? Is that what these things refers to?" Catherine's pen stopped moving across her notepad. Sterling's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained level. "I'm not sure what you're implying, but personal accusations have no place in this discussion." "Personal accusations?" Sarah stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "You've asked me to dinner 3 times in 2 months. When I declined, citing my wedding anniversary, you made it clear that my career advancement depended on accepting your invitations. Now, 2 weeks later, I'm being fired for performance issues that don't exist." "Ms. Mitchell," Catherine's voice carried a warning edge. "These allegations are serious and completely unfounded." Mr. Sterling has always maintained the highest professional standards. Your termination is based solely on performance metrics and team feedback. What team feedback? From whom? Sarah's voice was rising despite her efforts to maintain composure. Show me one documented complaint about my work, one negative review, one missed deadline or unsatisfied client. Catherine closed the folder with finality. The decision is not up for negotiation. Security will escort you to collect your personal belongings. As if summoned by magic, 2 security guards appeared in the doorway. Not Frank from downstairs, younger. Men Sarah didn't recognize, their expressions professionally blank. The ultimate humiliation, being marched through the office like a criminal while her former colleagues watched from behind their monitors. Her desk looked smaller somehow as she packed her belongings into a cardboard box that Catherine had thoughtfully provided. The photo of her and David, her coffee mug from their honeymoon in Vermont, the small succulent plant she'd been nurturing for 2 years. 3 years of her life reduced to objects that fit in a box that could be carried with 2 hands. Jennifer from Creative approached hesitantly. Sarah, I'm so sorry. This is insane. Everyone knows you're the best. Ma'am, please. Step away from Ms. Mitchell, one of the security guards interrupted firmly. Jennifer's eyes filled with tears as she backed away. Around the office, Sarah could see the fear in her colleagues' faces. If this could happen to her, despite her exceptional performance, it could happen to anyone. The elevator ride down was silent except for the mechanical hum of cables and gears. 32 floors of descent that felt like falling through the earth itself. In the parking garage, Sarah sat in her Honda Civic for nearly an hour, clutching the cardboard box and trying to process what had just happened. The corporate world she'd believed in, where merit mattered, where hard work was rewarded, where playing by the rules guaranteed fairness, had revealed itself to be a carefully constructed illusion. Sterling's power wasn't derived from his performance or leadership. It came from his position in a system designed to protect men like him and eliminate threats like her. Her phone buzzed with a text from David. Hope you're having a great morning. Can't wait to hear about your day tonight. Sarah stared at the message, her reflection ghost-like in the phone's dark screen. How could she explain that her great morning had included losing her career, her income, and her faith in institutional justice all before 10 a.m.? How could she tell her husband that the American dream they'd both believed in was more fragile than they'd imagined? The parking garage was quiet, except for the distant hum of traffic from the street above. Sarah started her car and drove toward their apartment, carrying her cardboard box of belongings and the growing realization that her real fight was just beginning. 7 days had passed since Sarah carried that cardboard box out of Sterling and Associates, and sleep had become a stranger. She'd spent the week in a haze of job applications and unanswered emails, watching her carefully constructed life unravel, one thread at a time. David had been supportive but helpless, bringing her coffee and gentle encouragement while she stared at her laptop screen, applying for positions that felt like steps backward in a career that had once seemed unstoppable. The apartment felt smaller each day, the walls closing in as unemployment benefits calculations and health insurance deadlines crowded her thoughts. She'd called 3 employment attorneys, but their consultation fees ranged from $500 to $800, money she couldn't afford to spend without knowing if she even had a case. It was David who found Rebecca Anderson's website late Thursday night, forwarding her the link with a simple message. This one looks different. Worth a try? Anderson and Associates occupied the 3rd floor of a brown brick building in Lower Manhattan, far from the gleaming towers of corporate law firms. The elevator was older, its brass buttons worn smooth by countless hands, and the hallway carpet showed decades of foot traffic. Sarah almost turned around twice, wondering if she was making a mistake consulting with someone whose office couldn't compete with Sterling's legal team. But the receptionist's genuine smile and the warmth in her voice when she said, "Ms. Mitchell? Rebecca's been looking forward to meeting you," made Sarah pause. When had anyone at Sterling and Associates ever looked forward to meeting with her? Rebecca Anderson's office reflected a practiced efficiency that spoke of long hours and passionate work. Law books lined every available wall space, their spines marked with colorful tabs and handwritten notes. A small table near the window held photos of Rebecca with groups of women, some holding certificates or awards, all beaming with the satisfaction of battles won. Rebecca herself was younger than Sarah had expected, maybe 40, with auburn hair, pulled back in a practical ponytail and sharp green eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She wore a navy blazer over dark jeans, professional but approachable, successful but not intimidating. "Sarah, please sit down. Would you like coffee? Tea?" Rebecca's voice carried a slight Brooklyn accent that immediately put Sarah at ease. "I know this kind of meeting can be nerve-wracking. Coffee would be wonderful." Sarah settled into a comfortable chair across from Rebecca's desk, noting how the attorney had arranged the seating to feel conversational rather than confrontational. "So tell me what happened," Rebecca said after pouring 2 cups from a coffee maker that looked well used. "Start from the beginning and don't leave anything out. Even details that seem unimportant might matter." Sarah began hesitantly, but Rebecca's attentive silence and occasional nods encouraged her to continue. She described Sterling's first dinner invitation, his increasing persistence, the uncomfortable undertones that made her skin crawl. Rebecca took notes in a neat shorthand, occasionally asking clarifying questions that showed she understood the nuances of workplace power dynamics. "The third time, when I mentioned my anniversary, his whole demeanor changed," Sarah said, wrapping her hands around the warm coffee mug. "It was like a mask slipped. For just a moment, I saw who he really was underneath all that charm." "And 2 weeks later, you were terminated," Rebecca finished, her pen pausing over her notepad. "With accusations that made no sense. Performance. Issues I'd never been warned about. Collaboration problems that came out of nowhere. Catherine Roberts, she's their head of legal. She delivered it like she was reading a grocery list." Rebecca leaned back in her chair, studying Sarah with those sharp green eyes. "You know, I hear stories like this more often than I'd like to admit. The pattern is always the same. Unwanted advances, rejection, sudden termination with fabricated performance issues. But can we prove it? I mean, legally prove it?" Sarah's voice carried the exhaustion of a week spent doubting herself and second-guessing every interaction she'd had at the firm. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. "That's always the challenge," Rebecca said honestly. "Employment law heavily favors employers. They have expensive legal teams, unlimited resources, and the benefit of doubt in most situations. But harassment followed by immediate retaliation, that's a pattern that speaks for itself, especially when the timeline is this clear." Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in days: hope. It was fragile, tentative, but real. "I should tell you," Rebecca continued. "I used to work for firms like Sterling and Associates, big corporate law, representing companies in exactly these kinds of cases. I spent 5 years helping employers cover up misconduct and silence victims." Sarah's hope flickered. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I know how they think, how they operate, and how they'll try to destroy your case. And I also know why I left that world." Rebecca gestured to one of the photos on her table, a young woman in graduation cap and gown, beaming beside an older woman who looked like Rebecca. "My niece." She was sexually harassed by her supervisor at her first job out of college. When she came to me for help, I realized I'd spent years being part of the problem. The silence stretched between them, filled with shared understanding and unspoken pain. "So you switched sides," Sarah said quietly. "I chose to fight for people instead of institutions. It pays less. The hours are just as long. And corporate lawyers think I'm a traitor. But I sleep at night. Rebecca set down her coffee and leaned forward. Here's what I can offer you, Sarah. I'll take your case on contingency. You don't pay unless we win. I'll work as hard for you as Sterling's. Lawyers will work against you. And I'll never lie to you about our chances or sugarcoat how difficult this will be. Sarah felt tears threatening for the first time since the termination. Not tears of despair, but something else entirely. Relief at finally being believed, at finding someone willing to fight alongside her. What do we do first? She asked. Rebecca smiled, and Sarah saw a hint of the fierce determination that had led her to abandon corporate comfort for this cramped office and these impossible cases. We build a case that shows exactly who Richard Sterling really is, Rebecca said, pulling out a fresh legal pad. And we make sure that what happened to you never happens to anyone else. For the first time in a week, Sarah felt like she could breathe fully. The fight ahead would be brutal, expensive, and uncertain. But sitting in this modest office with this passionate attorney, she finally understood that she wasn't alone. The system that had failed her might be powerful, but it wasn't invincible. Outside the window, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the city, and Sarah Mitchell began to transform from victim to fighter. The coffee had grown cold hours ago, but Sarah barely noticed as she hunched over Rebecca's conference table, surrounded by towers of documents that represented 3 years of her professional life. Employment contracts, performance reviews, email printouts, and witness statements created a paper fortress around them, each document a potential weapon in the legal battle ahead. Remember, we're looking for patterns, Rebecca said, her reading, glasses perched on the end of her nose as she examined Sarah's quarterly reviews. Inconsistencies in how you were treated versus other employees, any documentation that contradicts their termination claims, emails that show Sterling's real motivations. 3 weeks had passed since their first meeting, and Sarah had learned to think like a lawyer. Every interaction, every email, every performance metric had to be evaluated for its legal significance rather than its personal meaning. The process was exhausting, reliving her career through the lens of harassment and retaliation, transforming positive memories into evidence of discrimination. Look at this, Sarah said, pulling out a printed email from 6 months ago. Sterling forwarded my campaign presentation to the entire senior team with the subject line, "Exceptional work, exactly the kind of innovative thinking we need." How does that square with performance inconsistencies? Rebecca took the email, adding it to a growing pile marked "Evidence of Retaliatory Motive." It doesn't. That's why it's important. Corporate lawyers will argue that your termination was based on recent performance issues, but emails like this show their claims are fabricated. David appeared in the doorway with Chinese takeout, his teacher's bag slung over his shoulder and exhaustion written across his face. The past 3 weeks had been brutal for him, watching Sarah disappear into legal research while he managed their increasingly tight finances alone. His paycheck covered rent and groceries, but barely, and the stress was showing in the new lines around his eyes. "How are we doing?" he asked, setting the food on the only clear corner of the table. "Making progress," Rebecca said diplomatically. "Sarah's documentation is better than most clients provide. She has a paper trail that supports her version of events." David's smile was strained. "That's great. Really great." He looked at Sarah, who was already diving back into a stack of personnel policies. "Honey, you need to eat something." "In a minute," Sarah murmured, highlighting a section about the company's anti-harassment procedures. "Rebecca, look at this. Policy. It says employees can report harassment to HR or their direct supervisor. But what if your direct supervisor is the harasser? Exactly the kind of institutional failure we'll argue enabled Sterling's behavior," Rebecca said. "The policy creates an impossible situation for victims. David unpacked the Chinese food with mechanical precision, his movements growing sharper with each container. Sarah could feel his frustration radiating across the room, but she couldn't stop working. Every document they reviewed brought them closer to understanding Sterling and Associates' pattern of protecting perpetrators while silencing victims. Sarah, David's voice carried an edge she rarely heard. Please, eat with me. She looked up to find him standing with 2 plates of food, his expression mixing love with something that looked dangerously close to resentment. The realization hit her like a physical blow. While she'd been building her case, her marriage had been slowly eroding under the weight of financial pressure and her obsessive focus on the lawsuit. I'm sorry, she said, setting down her highlighter. I know this has been hard on you too. It's not about me, David said quietly, though they both knew that wasn't entirely true. It's about us, about what we're becoming. Rebecca gathered her papers with practiced efficiency. I'll leave. You two to dinner. Sarah, we've made excellent progress today. Try to take the evening off. Your mind needs rest to process everything we've covered. After Rebecca left, Sarah and David sat across from each other at their small dining table, the Chinese food growing cold between them. The silence stretched uncomfortably, filled with unspoken concerns about money, the future, and the cost of seeking justice. I got a call from the school district today, David said finally. They're offering summer teaching positions, extra money for curriculum development. It would mean working through July, but we need the income. Sarah felt guilt twist in her stomach. His summer break was supposed to be their time together, a chance to travel or simply relax after the school year's demands. Now he was sacrificing that because she'd lost her job fighting a battle that might be unwinnable. David, don't apologize, he said, reaching across to squeeze her hand. This isn't your fault. Sterling did this to us, not you. But I need to know we're going to get through this together. Rebecca thinks we have a strong case, Sarah said, though she could hear the uncertainty in her own voice. The timeline is clear. My performance record speaks for itself, and we have documentation of Sterling's inappropriate behavior. But what if we lose? David's question hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. What if they have better lawyers, more money, more connections? What happens to us then? Sarah stared at her untouched lo mein, the noodles congealing in their sauce. She'd been so focused on building a legal case that she'd barely considered the human cost of failure. If they lost, they'd face not only continued unemployment, but potentially massive legal bills and a reputation that would make finding another job nearly impossible. Employment law heavily favors employers, she said, repeating Rebecca's words. They have expensive legal teams, unlimited resources, and the benefit of doubt in most situations. Then why are we doing this? David's voice carried 3 weeks of suppressed anxiety and fear. Sarah looked around their small apartment, at the cardboard box from Sterling and Associates still sitting unopened in the corner, at the stack of overdue bills on David's desk, at the life they'd built together now threatened by her decision to fight back against Sterling's abuse of power. Because if we don't, she said slowly, he'll do it to someone else, and she might. Not have what I have, documentation, a good lawyer, a husband who loves her enough to eat Chinese takeout for dinner instead of the anniversary restaurant we can't afford anymore. David's expression softened, the love in his eyes mixing with worry and determination. Okay, he said simply. Okay, but promise me something. What? Promise me that if this fight starts destroying us, we'll find another way. I love you. More than any job, any principle, any amount of money. Don't let righteousness cost us our marriage. Sarah reached across the table and took his hands in hers, feeling the calluses from his weekend carpentry projects and the ink stains that never quite washed off his fingers. These were the hands that had held her during her breakdown in the parking garage, that had typed job applications when she was too devastated to function, that had counted and recounted their dwindling savings without complaint. "I promise," she said, and meant it. "But I also need you to understand that I can't go back to believing that being good and working hard is enough. That world doesn't exist anymore, if it ever did." Outside their window, Manhattan hummed with its usual evening energy, full of ambition and possibility. But inside their small apartment, Sarah and David held hands across their dining table and acknowledged that their fight for justice might cost them everything they'd built together. The question was whether they were strong enough to pay that price, and whether the victory would be worth the sacrifice. The Chinese food grew cold as they talked, planning for a future that felt increasingly uncertain, bound together by love and the shared understanding that some battles had to be fought regardless of the cost. The afternoon sun filtered through the dusty windows of Rebecca's office as she hung up the phone, her expression mixing frustration with determination. Sarah looked up from the employment records spread across the conference table, noting the tension in her attorney's shoulders. That was the fourth former Sterling and Associates employee who suddenly developed amnesia about Richard Sterling's behavior, Rebecca said, tossing her notepad onto the desk. Amazing how memory loss seems to be contagious among people who still work in Manhattan advertising. Sarah had spent the morning reviewing personnel files that Rebecca's investigator had obtained through public records requests. The pattern was disturbing, a steady stream of talented women who'd left Sterling and Associates abruptly over the past 5 years, most citing personal reasons or career changes that didn't align with their professional trajectories. "What? About Jennifer Walsh?" Sarah asked, pointing to a file that had caught her attention. "She left 2 years ago, right after getting promoted to senior creative director. The timeline doesn't make sense. Why leave after a promotion?" Rebecca pulled Jennifer's file closer, scanning the employment dates and department transfers. Creative director to? Nothing. No forwarding address in her personnel file, no LinkedIn updates for 6 months after leaving. That's the behavior of someone who wanted to disappear. "Or someone who was forced to disappear," Sarah said quietly. It took Rebecca's investigator 3 days to locate Jennifer Walsh. She was working at a small boutique agency in Brooklyn, a significant step down from her previous position at one of Manhattan's most prestigious firms. When Rebecca called, Jennifer's response was immediate and decisive. "I have nothing to say about Sterling and Associates, and I don't want to be contacted again." But Rebecca had spent years learning to read between the lines of fear and trauma. The speed of Jennifer's refusal, the tremor in her voice, the way she'd hung up before Rebecca could explain why she was calling, all indicators of someone who'd been hurt and was still running from that pain. "She's terrified," Rebecca told Sarah after the failed phone call, which probably means she has a story worth hearing. The coffee shop in Park Slope was Jennifer's choice, neutral territory far from Manhattan's corporate landscape, with enough ambient noise to mask sensitive conversations. Sarah arrived first, choosing a corner table with clear sightlines to both entrances, a habit she'd developed since becoming hyper-aware of her surroundings. When Jennifer walked in 20 minutes later, Sarah almost didn't recognize her. That confident creative director from the Sterling and Associates website photos had been replaced by a woman who seemed to be trying to make herself invisible. Jennifer's blonde hair was now dark brown, cut in a severe bob that framed a face marked by wariness. She wore oversized sunglasses despite the overcast day and kept checking over her shoulder as she approached Sarah's table. "You're Sarah Mitchell," Jennifer said, sliding into the chair across from her. It wasn't a question. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," Sarah said carefully. "I know this isn't easy. I shouldn't be here." Jennifer's hand shook slightly as she wrapped them around. Her coffee cup? "I have a good job now, a quiet life. I don't need this coming back to haunt me." Rebecca arrived 10 minutes later, her presence both comforting and professional. She'd dressed down for the meeting, jeans and a sweater instead of her usual blazer, But her legal training was evident in how she positioned herself to be non-threatening while remaining alert to Jennifer's emotional state. "Jennifer, I want you to know that anything you share with us today is confidential," Rebecca began. "We're not asking you to commit to anything. We just want to understand what happened to you at Sterling and Associates." For a long moment, Jennifer said nothing, staring into her coffee as if it might contain answers to questions she'd been avoiding for 2 years. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "It started the same way yours probably did," she said to Sarah. "Dinner invitations, business meetings that felt like dates, comments about my appearance that went just slightly beyond professional compliments." Sarah felt her stomach tighten with recognition. "How long did it go on?" "Months. Sterling was clever about it. Never anything you could definitively call harassment. Just persistent enough to make me uncomfortable, subtle enough that I questioned whether I was overreacting." Jennifer's laugh was bitter. "He made me feel crazy for being bothered by his attention." Rebecca leaned forward slightly. "What changed?" "The promotion to senior creative director. I thought it meant he'd finally see me as a professional equal, that the inappropriate behavior would stop." Jennifer pulled off her sunglasses, revealing eyes that still carried shadows of trauma. "Instead, it got worse. He said the promotion came with additional responsibilities and closer collaboration with senior management." Sarah's hands clenched involuntarily. "Meaning?" "Meaning he expected the dinner invitations to finally be accepted. When I kept declining, he started making my work life impossible. Projects I'd developed for months suddenly needed creative redirection. Clients I'd worked with for years were told I was being reassigned. My team was slowly transferred to other departments." The coffee shop buzzed with ordinary conversations, people planning weekend trips, discussing work projects, complaining about subway delays. The normalcy of it all felt surreal as Jennifer described a systematic campaign of professional destruction. "I tried going to HR," Jennifer continued. "Michael Davis, he seemed sympathetic, said he'd look into it. But nothing changed, and Sterling started making comments about my attitude problems and difficulty accepting feedback." Rebecca took careful notes, her expression growing grimmer with each detail. "What finally made you leave?" Jennifer was quiet for so long that Sarah wondered if she'd decided to stop talking. When she finally answered, her voice was flat, emotionless in the way that suggested deep trauma carefully contained. "Sterling cornered me after a client presentation. Told me that if I wanted to keep my position, I needed to show more appreciation for mentorship opportunities. When I tried to leave, he blocked the door." Jennifer's breathing became shallow. "He didn't touch me, but he made it clear that he could, that no one would believe me if I complained." Sarah felt sick. "That's when you quit?" "I stopped showing up the next day, just disappeared. Took a vacation day that turned into sick leave that turned into resignation. I couldn't face going back into that building, knowing he was there, knowing that the system that was supposed to protect me had failed completely." The 3 women sat in silence, the weight of Jennifer's story settling over them like a heavy blanket. Around them, the coffee shop continued its cheerful oblivious to the conversation unfolding in the corner table. "Jennifer," Rebecca said gently, "would you consider testifying about your experience? Your story corroborates Sarah's claims and shows a pattern of behavior." Jennifer's response was immediate and panicked. "No, absolutely not. I can't risk having my name associated with this. I've built a new life, and I won't let him destroy it again." "I understand," Sarah said quickly. "I really do. 2 months ago, I never would have imagined I'd be sitting here, planning to take on one of Manhattan's most powerful advertising executives. But Jennifer, if we don't stop him, he'll do this to someone else." Jennifer's eyes filled with tears. I know that. I've thought about that every day for 2 years. But I can't be the one to stop him. I don't have the strength left. As Jennifer gathered her purse and prepared to leave, Sarah felt their case, and their chance for justice, slipping away. But she also understood, perhaps better than anyone, the terror that kept Jennifer silent. The question was whether they could build a strong enough case without her testimony, or whether Sterling's pattern of abuse would continue unchallenged, protected by the silence of his victims. Michael Davis sat alone in his Sterling and Associates office at 9:30 p.m., the building's silence broken only by the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant rumble of late-night traffic. Spread across his desk were personnel files that told a story he'd been willfully ignoring for 15 years. A story of talented women who'd left the company under circumstances that, viewed together, formed a damning pattern. The formal discovery request from Rebecca Anderson's law firm had arrived that morning, demanding his deposition in Sarah Mitchell v. Sterling and Associates. Michael had stared at the legal document for an hour, his coffee growing cold as he realized that his careful neutrality was about to be shattered. He could no longer pretend to be an innocent bystander in a system that protected predators and silenced victims. Jennifer Walsh's file lay open before him, her resignation letter dated exactly 1 day after she'd come to his office seeking help. I need to report inappropriate behavior by a senior executive, she'd said, her hands trembling as she described Sterling's escalating advances. Michael had promised to investigate, had assured her that the company took such allegations seriously. But when he'd briefed Catherine Roberts the next day, the head of legal had made it clear that pursuing the matter would be disruptive to company operations and potentially damaging to all parties involved. Jennifer had resigned before Michael could follow up, disappearing so completely that he'd convinced himself she'd simply found a better opportunity elsewhere. But now, looking at the dates and documents, he understood that his inaction had driven her away. His desk drawer held a thick folder marked Confidential, 15 years of complaints, settlements, and non-disclosure agreements that Catherine's department had carefully managed to keep hidden. Women who'd been promoted and then mysteriously demoted. Harassment allegations that had been quietly resolved with financial settlements and strict confidentiality clauses. A pattern of abuse that the company's leadership had not only tolerated, but actively concealed. Michael's reflection stared back at him from his darkened window, and he barely recognized the man he'd become. When had protecting the institution become more important than protecting the people within it? When had managing risk become synonymous with enabling predators? His phone buzzed with a text from his daughter, Emma. Dad staying late at debate practice. We're discussing workplace equality and sexual harassment. It's crazy how women still have to deal with this stuff in 2024. The irony hit him like a physical blow. His 17-year-old daughter was spending her evening learning to argue for justice and equality while he sat in his office, complicit in perpetuating the very systems she was preparing to fight against. Emma had grown up believing her father worked for a progressive company that valued fairness and integrity. She had no idea that he'd spent years burying complaints and protecting abusers. Michael opened Emma's contact in his phone and stared at her profile picture. A photo from last year's debate tournament where she'd placed second in the state finals, beaming with pride and confidence. She planned to study law at Columbia, following in the footsteps of her mother, who'd been a civil rights attorney before cancer took her 5 years ago. What would Mom do? Michael whispered to the empty office, though he already knew the answer. Lisa Davis had never compromised her principles for comfort or security. She'd taken on cases that paid little but mattered much, fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves. She would have been disgusted by what he'd become. His computer screen displayed Rebecca Anderson's formal request for his deposition, scheduled for the following Tuesday. Michael could invoke his Fifth Amendment rights, claim potential self-incrimination, or simply provide minimal responses that protected the company while offering no real assistance to Sarah's case. Catherine Roberts had already scheduled a meeting for tomorrow morning to prepare his testimony and ensure his responses aligned with the company's legal strategy. But as Michael looked at the personnel files scattered across his desk, Sarah Mitchell's exemplary performance reviews alongside fabricated termination documents, Jennifer Walsh's harassment complaint buried beneath layers of corporate doublespeak, dozens of other women whose careers had been derailed by Sterling's predatory behavior, he realized he'd reached a crossroads that would define not just his career, but his character. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. Emma's name appeared on the screen. "Hey, sweetheart," he answered, grateful for her voice in the crushing silence of his moral crisis. "Dad, you sound tired. Long day?" "Something like that. How was debate practice?" "Intense. We were discussing this case study about workplace harassment, and our coach made this point about how institutional complicity is often worse than the original crime. She said that when good people stay silent, they become part of the problem." Emma's voice carried the passionate certainty of youth. "It got me thinking about your company. You guys must have really good policies to prevent that kind of thing, right?" Michael closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his daughter's trust and admiration. "What would you think of someone who knew about harassment but didn't speak up?" he asked carefully. "That they're cowards," Emma said without hesitation. "I mean, I get that it's complicated and people are scared of losing their jobs. But at some point, you have to choose between your comfort and doing what's right. Mom always said that good people who stay silent aren't actually good people." After ending the call, Michael sat in the darkness for another hour, Emma's words echoing in his mind alongside Lisa's memory. He thought about Sarah Mitchell, whose only crime had been rejecting Sterling's advances while excelling at her job. He thought about Jennifer Walsh, who'd trusted him with her vulnerability and received betrayal in return. He thought about all the women whose names filled the confidential files, whose careers and confidence had been sacrificed to protect Richard Sterling's reputation and the company's stock price. At 11:30 p.m., Michael made his choice. He opened his laptop and began typing an email to Rebecca Anderson. "Ms. Anderson, I received your deposition request today. There are things you need to know about Sterling and Associates' handling of harassment complaints, things that go far beyond Sarah Mitchell's case. I'm willing to testify fully and honestly about what I've witnessed and what documents I've seen. I understand this decision may cost me my career, but I can no longer be complicit in protecting a system that destroys innocent people." As he hit send, Michael felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the relief that comes from choosing principles over comfort, truth over convenience. Tomorrow would bring Catherine Roberts' fury, potential termination, and the collapse of everything he'd built over 15 years. But for the first time since Lisa's death, he felt worthy of his daughter's respect and his wife's memory. Outside his window, Manhattan's lights twinkled with the ambitions and dreams of millions of people trying to build better lives. Michael gathered the confidential files, knowing that his testimony could help ensure that at least some of those dreams wouldn't be crushed by predators like Richard Sterling. It was too late to save Jennifer Walsh's career or undo years of institutional complicity, but it wasn't too late to help Sarah Mitchell fight back. The building's security guard would find him there the next morning, still working by lamplight, preparing to demolish the system he'd spent 15 years helping to build. Catherine Roberts read Michael Davis's resignation letter for the third time, her jaw tightening with each word. The HR manager's betrayal had been swift and devastating. Not only had he agreed to testify for Sarah's legal team, but he'd provided Rebecca Anderson with copies of confidential files that exposed years of harassment settlements and cover-ups. The careful defensive strategy Catherine had constructed was crumbling, and she refused to let Richard Sterling's recklessness destroy everything she'd built. "We need to discredit them all," Catherine told her assembled legal team in the conference room that had become their war room. "Sarah Mitchell, Michael Davis, and anyone else who thinks they can damage this company. I want private investigators on all of them. Find their vulnerabilities, their secrets, their weaknesses. Everyone has something to hide. Within 48 hours, Sarah's quiet life became a surveillance nightmare. She first noticed the black sedan parked across from her apartment building, the same car that seemed to appear wherever she went. The grocery store, Rebecca's office, even the small cafe where she'd started meeting with other women who'd reached out after news of her lawsuit began circulating through industry networks. The investigator was professional but obvious, a middle-aged man with a camera who made no effort to hide his presence. Sarah understood the message. We're watching you, documenting your every move, looking for anything that could be used against you in court. But the real psychological warfare began when David called her from school, his voice tight with anxiety. "Sarah, I need you to come pick me up. Now." She found him in the parking lot behind Jefferson High School, his face pale and his hands shaking. "What happened?" "Principal Morrison called me into his office an hour ago, said he'd received a phone call questioning my wife's mental stability and suggesting I might be under undue stress at home." David's voice cracked slightly. "They asked if I needed counseling resources or if my domestic situation was affecting my teaching performance." Sarah felt ice form in her stomach. "They're going after your job." The caller claimed to be a concerned parent who'd heard about my wife's erratic behavior and unfounded accusations against respected business leaders. Morrison doesn't believe it, but he had to document the complaint. If more calls come in. David didn't need to finish the sentence. Budget cuts had already made his position precarious, and any hint of scandal could provide the excuse they needed to eliminate his job. That evening, their apartment felt like a fortress under siege. Sarah closed the blinds and checked the locks, twice while David graded papers with mechanical precision, both of them acutely aware of the black sedan parked across the street. Their phone rang 6 times in 3 hours, hang-ups each time, but the psychological effect was cumulative and devastating. "They want us to crack," Sarah said, peering through a gap in the blinds. "Catherine Roberts is trying to make us so miserable that we'll drop the case just to make it stop." Rebecca's office had become equally unwelcoming. Former colleagues who'd once collaborated with her on cases suddenly became unavailable for consultations. Clients began asking pointed questions about her current caseload and whether her firm was the kind of place that attracted troublemakers. The message was clear. Representing Sarah Mitchell came with professional consequences. But Catherine Roberts had underestimated the strength of the alliance building around Sarah's case. When Jennifer Walsh saw the news coverage of the harassment allegations, stories that Catherine's team had leaked to friendly reporters in an attempt to control the narrative, she felt something she hadn't experienced in 2 years: righteous anger. The tipping point came when Sarah discovered that her former colleagues at Sterling & Associates had been instructed not to speak with her under any circumstances. Marcus from accounting, who'd witnessed Sterling's inappropriate behavior firsthand, stammered through an uncomfortable conversation at a coffee shop near his apartment. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I want to help, I really do. But Catherine Roberts called a department meeting yesterday. Said anyone caught speaking with you or your legal team would face immediate termination for violating confidentiality agreements." Marcus looked genuinely pained. "I have kids, a mortgage. I can't afford to lose my job." "I understand," Sarah said, though understanding didn't make the isolation any less crushing. "They're making sure no one can corroborate my story." But Catherine's aggressive tactics created an unexpected consequence. The private investigators following Sarah had been instructed to document any meetings with potential witnesses, photographing everyone she encountered and investigating their backgrounds. When their reports landed on Catherine's desk, they revealed something the legal team hadn't anticipated. Other women were reaching out to Sarah, former Sterling & Associates employees who'd left under suspicious circumstances, and wanted to share their stories. The investigators had inadvertently created a roadmap of Sterling's victims. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "My name is Amanda Collins. I left Sterling and Associates 3 years ago. I need to talk to you." Then another. "Lisa Park. I was there from 2019-2021. Sterling destroyed my career too, and..." Another. "Rachel Foster. I thought I was the only one." Catherine Roberts had made a crucial miscalculation. By casting such a wide surveillance net, she'd revealed the true scope of Sterling's predatory behavior. Each woman the investigators identified became another potential witness, another piece of evidence that Sterling's harassment of Sarah was part of a systematic pattern spanning years. At home that night, Sarah and David sat on their couch reviewing the growing list of women who'd contacted her. The black sedan was still parked outside, its occupant probably photographing their silhouettes through the blinds. But for the first time since the corporate warfare began, Sarah felt something other than fear. "They're scared," she told David, scrolling through messages from Sterling's other victims. "Catherine Roberts is throwing everything at us because she knows her case is falling apart." David looked at the stack of bills on their coffee table, legal fees they couldn't afford, health insurance premiums they were struggling to pay, rent that would soon become impossible to manage on his teacher's salary alone. "But what if we can't survive their attacks long enough to win?" Sarah reached for his hand, drawing strength from his calloused fingers and the wedding ring that represented 3 years of partnership through challenges they'd never imagined. "Then we make sure our fight counts for something. Every woman who's reached out to me, every document Michael Davis provided, every day we refuse to give up. It all builds towards something bigger than just our case." The surveillance would continue, the harassment would escalate, and their financial situation would worsen. But Catherine Roberts' scorched earth strategy had backfired in the most spectacular way possible. Instead of isolating Sarah, the corporate warfare had united Sterling's victims and exposed the systematic nature of his abuse. Outside their window, the investigator adjusted his camera lens, documenting another evening in the lives of 2 people who refused to be intimidated into silence. He had no way of knowing that his photographs would eventually become evidence of witness intimidation, another crime to add to the growing case against Sterling and Associates. In trying to destroy Sarah Mitchell, Catherine Roberts had given her the very evidence she needed to win. Rebecca Anderson spread the private investigator's reports across her conference table like a battle map, each photograph and surveillance note representing another nail in Sterling and Associates' coffin. Catherine Roberts' scorched earth strategy had produced the most comprehensive documentation of witness intimidation Rebecca had ever seen, complete with timestamps, locations, and detailed descriptions of corporate harassment tactics. "They've handed us evidence of systematic witness tampering," Rebecca told Sarah, pointing to photos of the black sedan outside their apartment. "But more importantly, they've led us to every woman Sterling has ever victimized." The list had grown to 7 names: Amanda Collins, Lisa Park, Rachel Foster, and 4 others who'd reached out after seeing news coverage of Sarah's lawsuit. Each woman had a similar story: Sterling's escalating advances, professional retaliation, when they refused his attention, and eventual departure from the company under circumstances that protected Sterling while destroying their careers. Michael Davis had provided the smoking gun, personnel files showing that Sterling and Associates had paid out over $2.3 million in harassment settlements over 5 years, all accompanied by non-disclosure agreements that kept the victims silent. The pattern was undeniable, but Rebecca knew they needed something more. A public moment that would shift the narrative from disgruntled employee versus successful executive to systematic predator enabled by corporate corruption. Jennifer Walsh provided that moment, though not in the way anyone expected. She'd been watching the news coverage from her small Brooklyn apartment, seeing Catherine Roberts' legal team characterize Sarah as an unstable woman making false accusations for financial gain. When Sterling appeared on a business news show denying all allegations and describing Sarah as a troubled employee who couldn't handle professional feedback, Jennifer felt something snap inside her. The recording equipment was simple, just her laptop's camera and microphone. But Jennifer's testimony was devastating. She sat in her living room, speaking directly to the camera with the calm authority of someone who'd finally found her voice after years of silence. "My name is Jennifer Walsh. I worked at Sterling & Associates from 2019 to 2022, where I was sexually harassed by Richard Sterling and systematically punished for refusing his advances." Her voice was steady, her gaze unwavering. "I'm speaking out now because I've watched this man destroy Sarah Mitchell's career the same way he destroyed mine, and I can't stay silent anymore." Jennifer's 20-minute video detailed Sterling's pattern of harassment with surgical precision. The dinner invitations that weren't really invitations, the professional retaliation disguised as performance management, the way HR complaints disappeared into Catherine Roberts' legal machinery. She provided dates, witnesses, and documentation that corroborated every element of Sarah's case. But the most powerful moment came when Jennifer looked directly into the camera and said, "I left Sterling & Associates because I was terrified. I changed my name, my appearance, my entire life because Richard Sterling made me believe that speaking the truth would destroy me. But watching what they're doing to Sarah Mitchell, the surveillance, the intimidation, the character assassination, I realize that staying silent makes me complicit in his continued abuse of power." Jennifer posted the video to YouTube at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday, then sent copies to every major news outlet in New York. By noon, it had 50,000 views. By evening, it had gone viral. The response was immediate and overwhelming. "Believe Jennifer Walsh" began trending on social media, with thousands of women sharing their own stories of workplace harassment. Employment attorneys across the country called Rebecca's office, offering support and resources. Most importantly, Sterling & Associates' stock price began to fluctuate as investors questioned the company's liability exposure. But Richard Sterling, watching his carefully constructed reputation crumble in real time, made the mistake that would seal his fate. At 11:43 p.m., 3 hours after Jennifer's video reached 1 million views, Sterling called her directly. Jennifer's phone recorded the conversation automatically, a feature she'd enabled months earlier when anxiety made her paranoid about forgetting important calls. "Jennifer, it's Richard Sterling. I think we need to talk." The recording captured everything. Sterling's attempt to discredit Jennifer's testimony, his thinly veiled threats about her current employment, and his offer to make this all go away if she would recant her story. When Jennifer refused, Sterling's mask slipped completely. "You have no idea what you've done." His voice turned cold, calculating. "You think Sarah Mitchell's lawsuit is bad? I'll bury you both. I have resources. You can't imagine connections that reach everywhere in this industry. Withdraw that video, or I'll make sure you never work in advertising again." "Are you threatening me, Mr. Sterling?" Jennifer's voice was remarkably calm. "I'm promising you," Sterling replied. "Destroy your career and I'll destroy mine in return." Jennifer ended the call and immediately sent the recording to Rebecca Anderson, who forwarded it to the district attorney's office within the hour. Witness intimidation was a felony, and Sterling had provided a perfect audio recording of himself committing the crime. By morning, the story had exploded across every major news platform. The audio of Sterling threatening Jennifer played repeatedly on cable news, accompanied by headlines like "Exec caught on tape intimidating harassment victim" and "Sterling scandal, audio reveals corporate cover-up." Sarah woke to dozens of missed calls and text messages. The black sedan that had been parked outside her apartment for weeks was gone, replaced by news vans and reporters hoping for a statement. Her phone buzzed with a call from Rebecca. "Sarah, turn on Channel 7 News. Catherine Roberts just held an emergency press conference." On screen, Catherine Roberts looked haggard, her usual polished appearance cracking under the pressure of managing an unmanageable scandal. She announced that Sterling & Associates was conducting a thorough internal investigation and that Richard Sterling had been placed on temporary administrative leave pending the outcome of that investigation. The transformation was complete. In less than 24 hours, Jennifer's courage and Sterling's stupidity had shifted the entire dynamic of the case. Sarah was no longer an isolated victim making unsubstantiated claims. She was the lead plaintiff, in a case that exposed systematic corporate abuse and criminal witness intimidation. But the real victory wasn't legal or financial. As Sarah watched the news coverage, she received a text from Amanda Collins. "Jennifer's video gave me the courage to record my own story. We're not victims anymore. We're witnesses." Then from Lisa Park, "My testimony is ready whenever Rebecca needs it." And finally, from Jennifer herself, "Thank you for not giving up. Your fight made it possible for me to find my voice." Outside Sarah's apartment, reporters waited for statements and cameramen adjusted their equipment. The story had grown beyond individual grievances into a national conversation about workplace harassment, corporate accountability, and the courage required to speak truth to power. Catherine Roberts' warfare tactics had backfired spectacularly, transforming isolated victims into a united coalition of witnesses. Sterling's intimidation had been recorded and broadcast to millions. The company's stock continued falling as investors fled, and employment attorneys across the country began filing similar lawsuits against other corporations. Sarah Mitchell's refusal to stay silent had sparked exactly the kind of systemic change she'd hoped for. The question now wasn't whether they would win, but how much their victory would cost the institutions that had protected predators for far too long. The law firm of Morrison, Klein & Associates occupied 3 floors of a glass tower in Midtown Manhattan, its marble lobby and museum-quality artwork projecting the kind of institutional power that Sterling & Associates desperately needed. Sarah sat in the waiting area beside Rebecca, watching Catherine Roberts pace near the floor-to-ceiling windows while speaking in urgent whispers to a team of corporate lawyers who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. 5 days had passed since Sterling's recorded threats to Jennifer Walsh had dominated the news cycle. The company's stock had dropped 18%. 3 major clients had suspended their accounts, and the board of directors had called an emergency meeting to discuss reputation management and liability exposure. The settlement conference that Catherine had once dismissed as unnecessary was now Sterling & Associates' only hope of avoiding complete corporate destruction. "Remember," Rebecca murmured to Sarah as they were led into the conference room, "they're here because they're desperate. Everything they offer comes from a position of weakness, not strength." The conference room was designed to intimidate. Polished mahogany table, leather chairs that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and windows overlooking Central Park that reminded everyone of the stakes involved. Catherine sat at the head of the table, flanked by 3 lawyers, while a 4th man in an expensive suit introduced himself as the company's crisis management consultant. "Let's dispense with pleasantries," Catherine began, her voice tight with barely controlled frustration. "We're prepared to offer Ms. Mitchell a substantial settlement to resolve this matter quickly and quietly." Rebecca spread her own documents across the table with deliberate calm. "Before we discuss any offers, let's review what we're settling. Sexual harassment, retaliation, wrongful termination, witness intimidation, and now criminal threats captured on audio recording. The exposure goes far beyond Ms. Mitchell's individual case. Our client is prepared to offer $750,000, one of the corporate lawyers interjected, sliding a settlement document toward Sarah, in exchange for a full release of all claims and a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement. Sarah stared at the number, her mind reeling. $750,000, more money than she'd ever imagined having, enough to pay off David's student loans, put a down payment on a house, maybe start the consulting firm she'd always dreamed of. Financial security that would make the past months of struggle seem like a distant nightmare. But the NDA clause was extensive, covering not just the terms of the settlement, but any discussion of her experiences at Sterling & Associates. She would be required to deny that harassment occurred, to refuse any media interviews, and to actively discourage other victims from coming forward. "This is essentially paying me to help cover up Sterling's crimes," Sarah said quietly. "It's compensation for alleged damages," Catherine corrected sharply. "And it ensures that all parties can move forward without continued litigation that benefits no one." Rebecca leaned back in her chair, studying the settlement offer. "Interesting that you're willing to pay $750,000 for something you claim never happened. What does that tell us about the strength of your position?" The crisis management consultant cleared his throat. "Ms. Anderson, surely you understand that litigation is expensive and unpredictable. This offer allows your client to receive substantial compensation without the risks inherent in a jury trial." "What risks?" Rebecca asked pointedly. "You mean the risk that a jury will hear Jennifer Walsh's testimony? The risk that they'll see the documented pattern of harassment spanning 5 years? The risk that they'll listen to the audio recording of your client threatening a witness?" Catherine's jaw tightened. "We're prepared to increase the offer to $2 million. The number hung in the air like a physical presence. Sarah felt David's hand squeeze hers under the table. They'd discussed this moment, but the reality of it was overwhelming. $1,200,000 would change their lives completely, would provide security they'd never experienced. "The offer comes with some additional conditions," Catherine continued. "Ms. Mitchell would be required to issue a public statement retracting her allegations and acknowledging that her termination was based solely on legitimate performance concerns." "You want me to lie," Sarah said, her voice steady, despite the emotions churning inside her. "We want closure," Catherine replied, "for everyone involved." Sarah looked around the conference room, at the expensive artwork that reflected corporate wealth built on silence, at the lawyers who made their living protecting institutions rather than people, at Catherine Roberts, whose career depended on burying uncomfortable truths. Then she thought about Jennifer Walsh, who'd risked everything to speak publicly about her experiences, about Amanda Collins, Lisa Park, and the other women who'd found their voices after years of silence, about the national conversation their case had sparked about workplace harassment and corporate accountability. "Can I have a moment to discuss this with my attorney?" Sarah asked. Catherine nodded, and Rebecca led Sarah to a smaller conference room down the hall. Through the windows, Manhattan stretched endlessly, full of ambition and possibility, but also full of women who faced the same choices Sarah was confronting now. "It's a substantial offer," Rebecca said carefully. "More than most harassment cases settle for, especially given the uncertainties of trial." "But?" Sarah prompted. "But taking this settlement means Jennifer Walsh spoke out for nothing. It means the women who've contacted us with their stories remain silenced. It means Sterling keeps his position. Catherine Roberts continues protecting predators, and the next woman who rejects Sterling's advances faces the same retaliation you did." Sarah stared out at the city below, thinking about the conversation she'd had with David the night before. He'd held her as she cried about the impossible choice she faced: financial security for her family versus justice for Sterling's victims. David had listened without judgment, then reminded her of something she'd said weeks earlier. Some battles have to be fought regardless of the cost. "What are our chances at trial?" Sarah asked. "Better than they were a week ago," Rebecca admitted. "Jennifer's testimony is devastating, the audio recording is damning, and Michael Davis provides insider corroboration. But corporate law firms like Morrison, Klein, and Associates don't lose often. They have unlimited resources, experienced litigators, and judges who tend to favor institutional stability over individual justice." Sarah nodded, understanding the risks. A trial could last months, cost hundreds of thousands in legal fees, and end with a jury deciding that Sterling's behavior was inappropriate but not illegal, that her termination was poorly handled but not retaliatory. She could walk away with nothing except crushing debt and a reputation that would make finding another job nearly impossible. But she could also win. She could force Sterling and Associates to admit their wrongdoing, implement meaningful policy changes, and send a message to other corporations that harboring predators came with real consequences. "There's something else to consider," Rebecca said quietly. "If we reject this settlement and go to trial, other victims will likely come forward. The case becomes bigger than just your individual experience. It becomes about systematic change." Sarah closed her eyes, hearing echoes of her conversation with Jennifer in that Brooklyn coffee shop. "If we don't stop him, he'll do this to someone else." The settlement would provide personal vindication and financial compensation, but it would also ensure that Sterling's pattern of abuse continued unchallenged. When they returned to the main conference room, Catherine Roberts was reviewing stock reports on her phone, the company's continued decline written in red numbers across her screen. She looked up expectantly as Sarah took her seat. "We need your decision, Ms. Mitchell," Catherine said. "This offer expires at 5 p.m. today." Sarah looked at Rebecca, then at David, then at the settlement documents that represented both salvation and surrender. The choice would define not just her future, but the future of every woman who worked for companies like Sterling and Associates. The conference room fell silent except for the distant hum of Manhattan traffic below, waiting for Sarah Mitchell to decide whether justice was worth more than money. Sarah's voice was steady when she finally spoke, cutting through the tension. In the conference room like a blade, "We reject the settlement. We're going to trial." Catherine Roberts's pen stopped moving across her notepad, her face cycling through disbelief, fury, and something that looked like fear. The corporate lawyers exchanged glances that suggested they'd been hoping for a different outcome, while the crisis management consultant immediately began typing what was undoubtedly damage control messaging. "Ms. Mitchell," Catherine said, her voice carrying a warning edge, "you're making a serious mistake. You're walking away from financial security to pursue a case with uncertain outcomes. Juries are unpredictable, trials are expensive, and corporate defendants have resources you can't match." "I understand the risks," Sarah replied, feeling David's supportive presence beside her and Rebecca's quiet pride across the table. "But some things matter more than money." Rebecca gathered her documents with efficient movements. "We'll see. You in court, Ms. Roberts. And we'll bring every witness, every document, and every piece of evidence that shows Sterling and Associates enabled systematic harassment for years." As they left Morrison, Klein and Associates, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since that afternoon in Sterling's office months ago: complete certainty about her choice. The elevator ride down felt like ascending rather than falling, each floor marking her journey from victim to advocate. 3 months later, Sarah sat in the plaintiff's chair in Judge Margaret Chen's courtroom, watching Catherine Roberts deliver Sterling and Associates' opening statement to a jury of 8 women and 4 men. The corporate legal team had clearly spent enormous resources preparing their defense, but they faced an impossible task: explaining away Jennifer Walsh's viral testimony, Sterling's recorded threats, and Michael Davis's damning insider evidence. The trial became a media sensation, with Court TV providing gavel-to-gavel coverage and Dark Sterling trial trending daily on social media. Employment attorneys across the country watched Rebecca Anderson systematically dismantle Sterling and Associates' defense, while women's rights organizations organized courthouse rallies supporting Sarah's courage. Jennifer Walsh's testimony proved to be the trial's most powerful moment. She spoke for 2 hours, detailing Sterling's pattern of harassment with surgical precision while maintaining the calm authority that had made her video so compelling. When Sterling's lawyer attempted to discredit her during cross-examination, Jennifer's response was devastating. "You're asking why I didn't report Mr. Sterling's behavior sooner," Jennifer said, looking directly at the jury. "I did report it, to HR, to his supervisors, to anyone who would listen. But Sterling and Associates had a system for handling these complaints. They buried them, silenced the victims, and protected the perpetrators. That system is on trial here, not just Richard Sterling. Michael Davis provided the institutional evidence that transformed individual harassment into corporate conspiracy. His personnel files revealed not just the $3 million in secret settlements, but the systematic way the company had hidden Sterling's behavior from investors, employees, and the public. When he described Catherine Roberts' instructions to manage the situation quietly, several jurors visibly recoiled. Sterling himself took the stand in his own defense, his Connecticut boarding school confidence cracking under Rebecca's relentless cross-examination. When she played the audio recording of his threats to Jennifer Walsh, Sterling's attempts to explain his words as misunderstood frustration sounded hollow even to his own legal team. But the trial's most significant moment came when Amanda Collins, Lisa Park, and 2 other former employees testified about their own experiences with Sterling's harassment. Catherine Roberts had fought desperately to exclude their testimony as prejudicial, but Judge Chen ruled that the pattern evidence was essential to understanding the systematic nature of the abuse. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning with a verdict that sent shockwaves through corporate America. $2 million in compensatory damages, $15 million in punitive damages, and a finding that Sterling and Associates had engaged in systematic harassment and retaliation that violated federal employment law. But the financial verdict was only the beginning of the institutional changes that followed. Within weeks, Sterling was terminated and criminally charged with witness intimidation. Catherine Roberts resigned under pressure. Her career in corporate law effectively ended. The company implemented mandatory harassment prevention training, established an independent ombudsman for employee complaints, and created a victim compensation fund for other women who'd been harassed. More importantly, Sarah's case inspired similar lawsuits across the country. The precedent established by her victory made it easier for other harassment victims to seek justice, while the media attention sparked congressional hearings on workplace harassment and corporate accountability. 6 months after the trial, Sarah Mitchell stood in the small office of her newly established consulting firm, Mitchell & Associates Employment Solutions. The company specialized in helping organizations develop genuine anti-harassment policies and creating systems that protected employees rather than executives. Her first client had been a small tech startup whose CEO wanted to build a company culture where talent mattered more than politics. The phone rang, interrupting her review of a policy proposal. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but the voice was young and nervous. "Ms. Mitchell, my name is Rachel Martinez. I work for Hartwell Communications here in Chicago, and I've been following your case. I think I need help." Sarah settled into her chair, pulling out a fresh legal pad. "Tell me what's happening, Rachel." The story was painfully familiar. A talented young account executive, a predatory supervisor, escalating harassment disguised as mentorship, and retaliation when advances were rejected. But this time, the victim was calling before losing her job, before years of silence and trauma, before accepting that the system couldn't be changed. "I documented everything," Rachel said, her voice growing stronger. "I have emails, witnesses, records of my performance before the harassment started. I saw what you did, how you fought back, and I realized I don't have to accept this." "You're right," Sarah said, already taking notes. "You don't have to accept it, and you're not alone." After the call, Sarah walked to her office window overlooking Lower Manhattan. The view wasn't as impressive as the one from Sterling & Associates' 32nd floor, but it represented something far more valuable: work that mattered, principles that couldn't be compromised, and the knowledge that her fight had created lasting change. Her phone buzzed with a text from David. "Dinner at Batsy. 7? Emma Davis wants to join us. She got into Columbia Law and wants to thank you for inspiring her to fight for justice." Sarah smiled, thinking about Michael Davis's daughter choosing law school based partly on watching her father find his moral courage. The ripple effects of standing up to institutional power were impossible to measure, but they were real and ongoing. A knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. Jennifer Walsh stood in the doorway, holding 2 coffee cups and wearing the confident smile of someone who'd reclaimed her voice. "Thought you might need caffeine," Jennifer said, handing Sarah a cup. "I just finished testifying in the Hartwell Communications case you referred to us. Amazing how much easier it gets once you realize that telling the truth is more powerful than any legal strategy." "How's the trauma counseling practice?" Sarah asked, referring to Jennifer's new career helping harassment victims process their experiences. "Growing every day. Turns out there were a lot of women who needed permission to heal." Jennifer settled into the chair across from Sarah's desk. "Speaking of which, there's something I wanted to discuss. I've been thinking about that book proposal the publisher sent. You know, about our experiences fighting Sterling and Associates." Sarah had been avoiding the decision about the book deal, uncertain whether she wanted to revisit the trauma even for the purpose of helping other victims. But sitting in her office, looking at the consulting contracts that proved systematic change was possible, she realized that their story needed to be told completely. "What would you want to call it?" Sarah asked. "Breaking the Glass Ceiling. How Corporate America Protects Predators and Why Silence Isn't Safety," Jennifer said without hesitation. "Catchy, right?" They spent the next hour outlining chapters that would detail not just their individual experiences, but the institutional failures that enabled harassment and the systemic changes needed to protect future victims. The book would be another tool in the ongoing fight against workplace abuse, another way to ensure that their victory led to lasting transformation. As evening approached, Sarah gathered her things and prepared to meet David and Emma for dinner. The settlement money she'd rejected would have provided security, but the victory she'd achieved had created something far more valuable, a legacy of courage that inspired others to speak truth to power. Her phone rang one more time as she was leaving the office. This time, the caller was a reporter from the Wall Street Journal working on a story about the wave of employment law reforms inspired by her case. "Ms. Mitchell, companies across the country are implementing new harassment prevention policies because of your lawsuit. How does it feel to know that your decision to reject the settlement has led to systematic change?" Sarah paused at her office door, looking back at the workspace where she helped other victims find their voices and build cases for justice. "It feels like the fight was worth it," she said simply. "Every difficult moment, every personal cost, every risk we took, it was all worth it if it means the next woman who faces harassment doesn't have to fight alone." Outside her building, Manhattan hummed with its usual evening energy, full of ambition and dreams and the constant possibility of change. Sarah Mitchell walked toward her dinner with David and Emma, carrying with her the knowledge that sometimes refusing to stay silent could transform not just individual lives, but entire systems of power. The glass ceiling hadn't just been cracked, it had been shattered, and the pieces were being swept away by women who'd found their voices and refused to be silenced. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.